Imagine you prescribe a patient a standard, heavily tested medication simply to stop their hands from shaking.
Right, like a standard tremor treatment.
Exactly. It's a totally classic treatment for Parkinson's disease. So, a few months go by, and suddenly you are being sued for over $200,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The patient is claiming that your little pill completely rewired their personality and, like, turned them into a compulsive, reckless casino gambler.
Which sounds completely ridiculous on the surface.
Right. It sounds like an absurd, desperate cash grab. But what if it's entirely biologically sound? What if the exact same chemical that suddenly caused this person to see these hidden, undeniable patterns in random roulette wheels is the very same chemical currently running your own brain?
That is a terrifying thought.
It is.
Yeah.
Because it's the chemical dictating the news you believe, the memories you cherish, and, how you decide who to blame for your everyday problems.
It's a really jarring realization, honestly, because the very biological tools we rely on to keep us sane and oriented in the world are constantly and secretly rewriting the rules of reality just to make it easier for us to digest.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up an incredibly dense, genuinely fascinating chapter of our source text titled The Narrative Fallacy.
And this material comes from a much broader work, right? A work dedicated to exploring the severe limits of human knowledge, our stubborn rejection of unexplainable causes, and this overarching concept of wild, untamable uncertainty.
Exactly. Specifically, we are looking at how we handle black swans, those incredibly rare, massive, high-impact events that just blindside us and change history.
Right.
So our mission today, and your mission as you listen, is to uncover why human beings are biologically, chemically, and psychologically hardwired to force neat logical links onto completely random facts.
Then we're going to look at the massive cost of that hardwiring. I mean, we need a story to survive, but that desperate need severely distorts our mental representation of the world.
It makes us incredibly vulnerable.
Completely. But more importantly, we're going to explore how we can actually protect ourselves from our own narrative-addicted brains.
So, to kick things off, the author of our source text shares this anecdote that just perfectly sets the stage for everything we are about to discuss. It takes place in Rome.
Ah, right. At a scholarly conference centered around aesthetics and science.
Yeah, which is an incredibly fitting venue because, as the author points out, aesthetics permeate everything in Rome. It is a culture built on presentation, beauty, and narrative, right down to the dramatic tone of everyday conversation.
So the author is attending this conference, and he crosses paths with this highly prominent, extremely charismatic professor from a university in southern Italy.
And this professor had just delivered a wildly impassioned presentation. Now, the author admits his Italian wasn't quite up to par for high-level scholarly debate, but this professor was so animated, like literally turning red with anger at certain points to hammer his thesis home, that the author found himself totally swept up in the vibe.
He agreed with the man's undeniable passion, even if the specific vocabulary was flying right over his head.
Right. So later that afternoon, they meet by the buffet at lunch. And this professor absolutely corners the author, just bursting with enthusiasm.
Because he had recognized the author and wanted to tell him how much he absolutely loved his previous book on randomness.
Yeah, he was a massive vocal fan of the book's central thesis. And that thesis argued that we humans are effectively blind to luck. We systematically, foolishly try to invent neat explanations for things that are actually just pure chance.
And they get so incredibly animated discussing the shared philosophy that they are practically forming a barricade in front of the food.
I can just picture it. You have the professor wildly gesticulating and speaking in heavily accented French, while the author is waving his arms trying to keep up in primitive Italian.
Exactly. And the professor is saying things like, "You show how stupid we are to systematically try to explain skills." He is completely militantly on board with the author's intellectual war against overinterpretation.
He gets it. He is a total ally. But then, and here's where we hit the punchline, the professor takes a breath, looks the author dead in the eye, and says, and I'm paraphrasing the translation here, but my dear friend, if you had grown up in a Protestant society that emphasizes individual responsibility and links effort to reward, you would never have seen the world this way.
Wow.
Yeah. He says you are only able to see luck and separate cause and effect because of your Eastern Orthodox Mediterranean heritage.
It is almost tragically comical. What's fascinating here is that here's a man who just spent 20 minutes passionately denouncing the human tendency to invent causes and weave stories out of random events.
Literally makes his living studying this exact cognitive flaw.
Right. Yet the moment he tries to understand the author and his book, his brain cannot tolerate the vacuum. He instantly invents a causal story.
He literally leans on the word because.
He had to invent a clean, geographic, cultural reason for the author's worldview. He fell headfirst into the causation trap he was just screaming about on stage without realizing it at all.
Okay, let's unpack this. If even brilliant professors who study the mechanics of overinterpretation fall into this trap without a flicker of self-awareness, is the need to invent stories just a bad cultural habit? Or is there something deeper in our wiring?
The source material is really unequivocal on this. It is entirely structural. It's anatomical.
So not just like reading too many novels.
No, not at all. This isn't a cultural quirk we can just unlearn. It is a biological mandate. And to understand the weight of that mandate, we have to look at the sheer exhausting nature of pure observation.
This is where the text makes a claim that honestly made me stop reading and just reread the paragraph. It argues that not theorizing, not imposing a narrative on what we see, is actually an active, effortful act.
Right. Theorizing and narrativizing is the biological default option.
Wait, isn't thinking a verb? How is withholding judgment the thing that takes effort? It's like saying letting your car idle burns more gas than driving it.
I see where you're going with the car analogy. But we have to flip our understanding of what the brain's engine is actually designed to do.
Okay, flip it how?
Think about your heartbeat, or your breathing, or your digestion. Those are highly complex actions requiring massive coordination, but they happen automatically, running in the background of your consciousness.
Why, I don't have to remind myself to digest my breakfast.
Exactly. But if you decide you want to actively hold your breath or consciously try to slow your heart rate down, that takes intense, focused, exhausting mental effort.
Because you are actively fighting your own autonomic nervous system.
Precisely. Brain functions like inference, pattern recognition, and interpretation operate the exact same way. Mother Nature designed them to run constantly, completely outside of our conscious awareness.
So to see a series of facts in their raw form without instantly weaving an explanation for them requires you to fight your own biology.
You have to maintain a continuous, highly vigilant state of alert to actively block your brain from making inferences. If you sit down in a park and try to just observe the actions of the people around you for an hour without internally assigning a why to their movements, you will walk away with a headache.
It causes extreme cognitive fatigue.
It really does.
Which brings us to the physical evidence of this automatic interpretation. And some of these experiments are just wild. The text highlights a classic study on post hoc rationalization known as the stalking experiment.
Oh, this one is fascinating. It perfectly illustrates how our brains absolutely hate a vacuum of meaning.
So, psychologists brought women into a room and presented them with 12 pairs of nylon stockings laid out on a table. They were asked to examine them, feel them, and choose the pair they considered the highest quality.
A seemingly straightforward consumer task.
Right? On the surface, yeah. The participants took it very seriously. They rubbed the fabric between their fingers, held them up to the light, and eventually made their choices. Then the researchers asked the crucial question, why did you choose that specific pair?
And the participants didn't hesitate at all. They had highly articulate, confident reasons.
Right. They pointed to a subtle superiority in the texture, a slightly more flattering shade of color, a better elasticity in the weave. They provided a detailed narrative of their decision-making process.
But the reality behind the curtain is that all 12 pairs of stockings were entirely identical.
Exactly identical. They were cut from the exact same batch on the exact same manufacturing line. There was zero physical difference between them.
Yet when faced with an essentially random choice, these women's brains absolutely refused to accept, I just grabbed one randomly.
The brain instantly supplied a back-fit, post-hoc explanation. It narrated a logic that never actually existed to make the random choice feel reasoned.
That experiment reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth. Human beings are vastly better at explaining than we are at actually understanding. We generate the explanation after the fact to comfort ourselves.
Right.
But if we want to move beyond psychology and look at the literal hard anatomical proof of this narrative engine, we have to look at the medical marvel of split-brain patients.
The text leans heavily on this, and I really want to spend some time here because the implications are staggering. Why do these patients exist in the first place?
It generally stems from a radical, last-resort treatment for severe, debilitating epilepsy. When seizures originate in one side of the brain and aggressively spread to the other, surgeons will sometimes perform a corpus callosotomy.
So they literally sever the corpus callosum, which is the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere.
Exactly. Once that bridge is cut, information can no longer be shared across the two halves. You effectively have two isolated, independent processing centers living inside a single human skull.
So the left hand truly doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right. But the crucial detail for our discussion is where certain cognitive functions live.
Right. The geography of the brain.
Yeah. For the vast majority of people, the capacity for speech, language, and complex logical interpretation resides heavily in the left hemisphere.
So how do researchers actually talk to just one half of the brain?
Through incredibly clever visual setups. By flashing words or images to only the extreme left or extreme right of the patient's visual field, researchers can beam a command exclusively to one hemisphere.
Oh, wow.
So, let's say the researchers secretly project a written command only to the isolated right hemisphere. The command says, point your finger at the ceiling. The right hemisphere reads it, processes it, and commands the patient's left arm to point upward.
The action happens. The arm goes up.
Yes, but then the researchers verbally ask the patient, meaning they are asking the left hemisphere, the side with vocal cords, and the interpreter module, why did you just point at the ceiling?
Now remember, the left hemisphere did not see the command. It has zero access to the actual reason the arm is currently raised.
So logically, the honest answer from the left brain should be, I am totally confused. My arm just shot up on its own.
But the brain abhors a mystery. That honest answer almost never happens, right?
Almost never. The left hemisphere observes the arm pointing up, realizes it lacks a reason, and instantly, seamlessly fabricates one. The patient will confidently say, oh, I was pointing at the ceiling because I saw a spider web up there. Or, I just felt a cramp and needed to stretch my shoulder.
Shouldn't they actually believe it?
They do. The left brain doesn't feel like it's lying. It acts as an automatic, relentless sense-making organ. It cannot tolerate an action without a cause, so it generates a narrative to explain the raw fact.
That is just terrifying. A piece of our brain is literally hallucinating a reality to maintain an illusion of control. And if you flip it, if you command the left hemisphere to do something and ask the right hemisphere why.
The right hemisphere doesn't have that frantic storytelling module. It usually just admits ignorance or gives a very literal, non-narrative response. This shows us that the compulsion to impose a story, to create a because, is a localized physical function of our biology.
And there is another experiment that takes this anatomical reality and turns it into a superpower, at least temporarily. The text introduces us to an Australian brain scientist named Alan Snyder.
Right, the transcranial magnetic stimulation study.
Exactly. He wanted to see what would happen if he could temporarily shut down that frantic storytelling module in the left hemisphere. He used low-frequency magnetic pulses fired into the left frontotemporal lobes of right-handed subjects.
He was essentially jamming the signal of the brain's narrative engine. He wanted to quiet down the part of us that constantly categorizes and explains.
The results were astonishing. When he zapped them, these ordinary subjects suddenly became significantly better at drawing. Their artistic verisimilitude just skyrocketed.
Which sounds so counterintuitive.
It does. How does turning off a part of the brain make you better at capturing reality on paper?
Well, it's because of what that left brain is normally doing. When you look at a chair, your left brain instantly categorizes it. It says, that is a chair, it has 4 legs and a back.
So when you try to draw it, you end up drawing your concept of a chair, your narrative of a chair, rather than the raw, specific geometric shapes and shadows that are actually in front of you.
Snyder's magnetic pulses temporarily knocked out the brain's conceptual dictionary. Clear to the need to impose a theory on the object, the subjects could finally see the raw visual data. They stopped seeing the story of the object and started seeing the object itself.
The author provides a great, simple optical illusion to prove how aggressively our brain glosses over raw data to maintain a concept.
Oh, the triangle text,
Yeah.
right.
If you're listening, picture a triangle. Inside that triangle is a short, simple phrase. The phrase is, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. I'll say the layout again. A bird in the hand.
Almost everyone who reads that quickly reads right over the double the H.
Our brain sees the familiar concept, the famous idiom, and immediately imposes the narrative. It literally edits out the granular, contradictory detail of the second the because it disrupts the smooth story our brain has already decided we were looking at.
We see the forest, and we completely hallucinate the trees.
Which brings us back to the bombshell from the introduction, the L-DOPA lawsuit. The text points out that there is a distinct chemical correlate to all of this frantic pattern matching, and it's dopamine.
Dopamine is a really complex neurotransmitter. We often hear about it in relation to pleasure and reward, but its function is much broader.
Right, it regulates mood and internal motivation.
Exactly. But what the source text highlights is that an elevated concentration of dopamine drastically lowers our skepticism. It basically turns the dial way up on our brain's pattern recognition software.
So when that Parkinson's patient was prescribed L-DOPA to manage their tremors, the medication artificially spiked their dopamine levels. And a known, heavily documented side effect in a minority of these patients is that they suddenly become compulsive gamblers.
The mechanics of that side effect are profound. The spike in dopamine caused that patient's brain to go into narrative overdrive.
They walked into a casino, looked at the completely random independent spins of a roulette wheel, and their chemically altered brain suddenly saw clear, undeniable patterns.
The chemical literally erased their suspension of belief. They weren't making bad mathematical calculations. Their perception of reality had been altered to force a because onto pure chance.
It redefines what we think of as intelligence. We usually consider the ability to connect the dots and see patterns as a sign of high intellect. But the text shows that when the chemistry is tweaked, knowledge actually becomes an ailment. We are held captive by our own neurotransmitters.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this biology exists for a reason. Mother Nature wouldn't give us a dopamine-fueled storytelling addiction unless it solved a massive logistical problem.
Okay, let's unpack that. Mother Nature is incredibly frugal. She doesn't waste biological energy. So what is the problem this flawed system is trying to solve in the ancestral environment?
To answer that, we have to shift from biology into information theory. We have to look at the work of the legendary probabilist Andrei Nikolaevich Kolmogorov and understand the sheer cost of information.
Information is costly.
Incredibly costly. The core problem our brains face every second of every day is that information takes energy to obtain, it takes physical neural space to store, and it takes massive computational power to manipulate.
The source text uses a brilliant analogy that we really need to flesh out to understand Kolmogorov's complexity. Let's imagine your brain as the Library of Congress.
Okay.
The physical building itself, the miles and miles of shelves representing your long-term memory, the billions of neurons that storage capacity is essentially limitless for our purposes. The attic is huge, but your consciousness, your working memory, your ability to actively think about things in the present moment, well, that is not the whole library. That is just a small wooden desk sitting in the middle of the reading room.
That distinction is paramount. No matter how many millions of books are safely stored in the library, your desk has a fixed, rigid, physical dimension. You can only stack a few open books on that desk at any given second.
This is why I can remember the lyrics to 100 songs I haven't heard since high school, but if you give me a random 7-digit phone number and ask me to hold it in my head while I walk across the room, I am struggling. My desk is instantly cluttered.
Exactly. The human working memory has severe bottlenecks. So, because our mental desk space is so strictly limited, we have to find a way to take the infinite complexity of the real world and shrink it down so it fits on the desk.
We must compress reality.
We have to. And the only way to compress information is to find a pattern.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about a standard 500-page book. Let's say that book is filled with 100,000 completely random, disconnected words spat out by a random number generator. Apple, sky, wrench, yellow, jump. Just nonsense.
Because there is no pattern, that book cannot be compressed. You cannot reduce its dimensions without losing significant parts of the information.
If your life depends on taking the exact message of that book across the country, you have no choice but to painstakingly memorize all 100,000 random words. It is uncompressible.
But consider the alternative. What if that exact same 500-page book is just the same 34-word sentence repeated over and over and over again?
Let's use the sentence from the text. The chairman of the company is a lucky fellow who happened to be in the right place at the right time and claims credit for the company's success without making a single allowance for luck.
If that one sentence just runs 10 times a page for 500 pages, the book looks just as thick. But the Kolmogorov complexity of that second book is minuscule. You don't need to burn the energy to memorize 100,000 words. You just memorize the 34-word rule, the pattern.
Print this sentence 15,000 times. From that tiny, highly compressed kernel, you can perfectly recreate the entire 500-page book. A pattern is infinitely more compact than raw, random information.
And that is what our brain is doing every millisecond. A pattern is more compact than raw info. Summarizing equals adding order. Adding order equals reducing the perceived randomness of the world.
We hunger for rules, categories, and most importantly, stories, because they reduce the massive, terrifying dimensionality of the world so we can literally squeeze it into our heads.
It is a survival mechanism for a data-flooded world. But that is also where we hit the danger zone. The very condition that allows us to process the world and not be completely paralyzed by trillions of random details is the exact same condition that tricks us into thinking the world is far more predictable and far less random than it actually is.
Art, mythology, historical biographies, they all serve this biological function. They spare us from the blinding complexity of raw reality.
The novelist E.M. Forster captured this beautifully. He made a profound distinction between a mere succession of facts and a plot. Imagine I tell you the king died and the queen died. That is a succession of facts, two independent data points.
Right.
Now imagine I change it to the king died and then the queen died of grief.
That is a plot. That is a narrative.
Yeah.
But the brilliant hitch there is that the second statement, the plot, actually contains more literal words. It has more text.
Yet if I ask you to remember one of those sentences a week from now, the second one is significantly lighter to carry in your brain.
Because the causal link, the grief, acts as a compression algorithm. It takes two disparate, floating facts and binds them together into a single, cohesive piece of information.
That is the fundamental function of a narrative. It packages data for highly efficient storage and effortless retrieval.
But doesn't making a story out of facts mess with our math? Like, doesn't this biological hack completely ruin our ability to accurately assess probability?
Oh, it completely breaks our math. The source mentions this incredible experiment involving Agatha Christie novels that proves how deeply narrative skews our logic.
Psychologists ran an experiment where they took a classic, tightly plotted detective novel, something with a handful of suspects who all have plausible motives. They gathered a group of readers and asked them, before the final reveal, to estimate the percentage probability of each specific character being the murderer.
Now, obviously there is only one murderer, so mathematically, the sum of all those individual probabilities cannot exceed 100%. If you think the butler is 50% likely and the heiress is 30% likely, that leaves only 20% to distribute among everyone else.
But human brains don't run on pure probability. They run on narrative plausibility. What the researchers found was that unless a reader was explicitly keeping a rigorous mathematical tally on a piece of paper, the probabilities they assigned to the characters added up to well over 100%.
In a really well-crafted novel, where the author provides a compelling, sensible motive for every single suspect, the combined probabilities would soar over 200%.
Because the narrative makes every single path feel so causally sound. When we read the chapter about the butler's secret debt, the story is so vivid that our brain screams, yes, it must be him. We assign him an 80% probability.
And then we read the chapter about the heiress's jealousy, the narrative clicks, and our brain assigns her an 80% probability. The better the story, the worse the math. We mistake a good story for a high probability.
So we compress the present into these neat little stories just to make it fit on our mental desk. But what happens when we pull those files back out years later? Are they the same files?
That moves us into the malleability of memory, which is a dynamic revision machine, not a static computer diskette. Conventional wisdom treats human memory like a hard drive. You experience an event, you save the file, and when you open it 5 years later, it is the exact same file.
But neurological reality is far more dynamic and disturbing. The 19th century Parisian poet Charles Baudelaire had an incredible, prescient insight into this. He compared human memory to a palimpsest.
A palimpsest being those ancient scrolls or pieces of parchment where monks would write a text and then decades later someone would scrape the ink off and write a new text over it. But the old text was never completely gone. It lingered in the background, bleeding through.
That is exactly what memory does through a process psychologists call reverberation. Every single time you recall a memory, you are not opening a read-only file. You are pulling the parchment out, reading it, and then rewriting it before you put it back.
And the danger is that you are rewriting it based on posterior information.
I love the idea of updating the palimpsest metaphor for a modern listener. It's less like opening a read-only PDF on your desktop and more like pulling up a live Wikipedia page. Every time you open that memory, your current mood, what you ate for breakfast, and most dangerously, everything you have learned about the world since the event happened gets secretly edited into the text by an anonymous moderator before you even start reading.
That posterior information acts as a gravitational pull. We pull memories along causative lines. It is virtually impossible for the human brain to ignore what it knows now when looking back at them.
This is the engine of hindsight bias. History always appears incredibly neat, explainable, and inevitable in the history books compared to the terrifying chaos of actually living through it.
We look back at World War I and think, well, obviously once the Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo, a global mechanized war was inevitable.
We edit out the thousands of random, non-causal details, the mistrained connections, the sheer dumb luck that didn't fit the final narrative of the war. We act as a self-serving, dynamic revision machine.
You aren't remembering the event, you're remembering the last time you remember the event, smoothing out the story every single time.
And the source text points out how dangerous this logic of coherent interpretation can become, particularly when we look at extreme cases like paranoid disorders.
If you examine a highly intelligent person suffering from paranoia, you will see the narrative fallacy running in absolute overdrive. They can take the most utterly insignificant random details, a neighbor clearing their throat, a misplaced pen on a desk, a specific car driving by twice, and construct a perfectly coherent, logical, watertight conspiracy theory out of it.
The terrifying part is that their story often makes complete logical sense. It is a masterpiece of cause and effect storytelling.
But a coherent story does not equal a true story. The mid-century logician W.V. Quine argued this beautifully. He demonstrated that for any given finite series of facts, there exist entire, vast families of logically consistent interpretations that match those facts perfectly. The mere absence of nonsense does not make something true.
There is a charming anecdote the author shares from his childhood that perfectly encapsulates Quine's point. The author is 7 years old in a classroom in Lebanon. The school teacher shows the class a painting depicting impoverished Frenchmen in the Middle Ages at a banquet.
Right.
In the painting, all these men have their faces buried deep in their soup bowls, slurping away. The teacher asks the class, "Why are they eating like that?" The 7-year-old author raises his hand and says, "Because they were not taught manners."
A perfectly reasonable guess for a 7-year-old.
But the teacher immediately rebukes him and says, "Wrong. The reason is that they are starving and hungry."
As the author reflects on it as an adult, he asks, why was the teacher so absolutely, rigidly confident that her explanation was the correct one? If you look at the historical data, there was little to no silverware available to the common man at that time. Eating directly from the bowl was simply the mechanical reality of the era. That is the most empirically likely explanation.
But the teacher had immediately constructed a dramatic narrative, hunger and desperation, that perfectly fit the visual facts in her mind. Once that satisfying story locked into place, she shut down any alternative logical paths. The story felt too right to be wrong.
We do this constantly in our personal lives, assigning grand motives to our partners, our bosses, our politicians, based on a handful of visual clues. However, to introduce some nuance, the text also notes that this narrativity isn't always toxic. We can actually harness this biological quirk as a powerful form of therapy.
Right, the narrative fallacy causes us to see past events as far more predictable and less random than they truly were. Usually that is a massive intellectual liability. But what if you're suffering from the look-back sting? What if you're being tortured by the randomness of life?
The look-back sting is that toxic, paralyzing feeling of constant second-guessing after a tragedy. Say you were in a severe car accident, and your mind is trapped in an endless loop of alternative random scenarios. If I had just left the house 3 minutes later, if I hadn't stopped for coffee, if I had taken the highway instead of the back roads.
Or, in a financial context, the agony of watching a market crash and thinking, if I had just sold my portfolio on Tuesday, I'd be secure.
It's the agonizing realization that a massive, life-altering event hinged on tiny, random, meaningless decisions.
The chaos is what hurts. If a patient tries to just suppress those thoughts, it often backfires, increasing anxiety. But psychological studies show that patients who engage in structured journaling, spending 15 minutes a day writing a cohesive account of their trauma, experience significant emotional relief.
And the mechanism for that relief is the narrative itself. The physical act of writing forces your brain to take the chaotic, floating variables and weave them into a linear story.
And as we learned from E.M. Forster, stories make events feel inevitable. When you write it down, it starts to feel less like a random cosmic joke and more like a chapter in a larger story that was bound to happen. The narrative acts as a shock absorber. It absorbs the toxic sting of constant second-guessing.
So we employ this narrative machine to survive the data deluge, to store our memories efficiently, and sometimes to heal our own psychological wounds.
So we do this to ourselves to survive, to store memories, to heal. But what happens when massive industries weaponize this biological vulnerability against us?
We enter the realm of sensationalism, the media.
So what does this all mean when it comes to the news?
The text gives us a masterclass in the pathology of the modern media. Their entire business model relies on desperately providing a cause for every single event, no matter how complex, to make the news easily swallowable for a public that has limited desk space in their working memory. Journalists want, as the text brilliantly puts it, to be wrong with infinite precision.
The Bloomberg News example from December 2003 is iconic. It is one of the most illuminating and frankly hilarious things in the source material, and it perfectly exposes the man behind the curtain. Let me paint the scene. It's a massive news day. Saddam Hussein has just been captured.
A huge global event.
The entire world is reacting.
Yeah.
At exactly 13.01, U.S. Treasury bonds rose in price.
Which is a standard market fluctuation driven by thousands of algorithmic and human trades.
But a financial news terminal can't just say bonds fluctuated. So Bloomberg News flashes the headline, U.S. Treasuries rise. Hussein capture may not curb terrorism. They looked at the market mover, the rise, they looked at the massive news event of the day of the capture, and they confidently, unequivocally linked them.
They manufactured a because. The bond market moved because investors realized the capture wouldn't stop terrorism, so they sought the safety of government bonds. It sounds incredibly logical. It is a perfect compressed story.
It sounds perfect, but here is where it falls apart spectacularly. Half an hour later, at 13.31, those exact same U.S. Treasury bonds fell in price. They reversed course, which, again, they do all day long. But Bloomberg News needed a new headline to explain the fall, so they release a brand new bulletin. U.S. Treasuries fall, Hussein capture boosts allure of risky assets.
It is the exact same capture, the exact same root cause, and yet, within a 30-minute window, the media confidently used it to explain both an event and the exact opposite of that event. It is logically impossible for the capture to inherently cause both a rise and a fall for completely contradictory psychological reasons.
But the journalist writing that headline, much like the left hemisphere of the split-brain patient, cannot tolerate a vacuum. The journalist sees the arm point at the ceiling or the bond market tick down and instantly fabricates the spider web to explain it.
The terrifying thing is that the public accepts it. We wouldn't click on a headline that said, U.S. Treasuries fluctuated today due to millions of complex micro-interactions that no human can fully map.
We demand a story. We demand a clean cause and effect. The text notes with heavy irony that while modern media employs armies of fact-checkers to ensure dates and spellings are correct, there are absolutely no intellect checkers to ensure the core logic of the causal link actually holds up.
And when journalists, or even just everyday people, lack concrete information to build a story around a person's behavior, we default to the cheapest, most readily available narrative we have, nationality. This loops perfectly back to the Italian professor from the very beginning.
Right, the professor who blamed the author's worldview on his Eastern Orthodox Mediterranean heritage. The text calls this cognitive shortcut the nationality dump site.
It is a fascinating phenomenon, and it's crucial to understand that the source treats this not as a political or cultural grievance, but strictly as an empirical statistical failure. Empirically speaking, relying on national identity or national temperament as a predictor of an individual's behavior is totally bogus.
It's just terrible math.
The text cites a massive, comprehensive paper published in the journal Science by 65 co-authors that proved national traits carry virtually zero empirical validity.
So saying he is hot-headed because he's Italian, or she is reserved because she's British, is statistically meaningless.
Completely. If you genuinely want to predict a stranger's behavior, their sex, their social class, and their profession are vastly superior, highly accurate metrics. As the author points out, a philosophy professor from Peru has vastly more in common psychologically and behaviorally with a philosophy professor from Scotland than he does with a janitor from his own hometown in Peru.
So why do we cling to the nationality excuse so tightly if it's statistically garbage?
Because it is cognitively cheap. Assessing someone's true socioeconomic background, their professional microculture, their individual psychological makeup that requires massive desk space in our working memory, It requires deep analysis.
But nationality is a pre-packaged story. We all have a cartoonish, culturally ingrained narrative of what a Frenchman or a Texan is. When we are confused by someone's behavior, we just dump the causality into the nationality dump site because it instantly satisfies our hunger for a because without requiring us to burn any cognitive calories.
This preference for the sensational prepackaged story over the complex, abstract reality dictates almost everything we do. It dictates where we direct our empathy, where we spend our tax dollars, and what we fear. This is where we develop black swan blindness.
When we are faced with dry, accurate statistics, our brains effectively go numb. But when we are faced with a vivid story, our risk assessment completely short-circuits.
The legendary psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky ran an incredible experiment that empirically proves this short circuit. They gathered a group of forecasting professionals, people whose entire career relies on understanding probability and risk, and asked them to estimate the odds of two different hypothetical scenarios.
Okay, what were the scenarios?
Scenario A. A massive flood occurs somewhere in North America in which more than 1,000 people die. Scenario B. An earthquake occurs in California, causing a massive flood in which more than 1,000 people die.
Now let's step into the shoes of those forecasters. From a purely mathematical Venn diagram standpoint, Scenario A has to be the more likely event. It is the broader category. Scenario A includes all possible floods across an entire continent, hurricanes in Florida, dam breaks in the Midwest, and yes, even the earthquake-induced flood in California from Scenario B. Scenario B is just a tiny subset of Scenario A.
Basic logic dictates the subset cannot be more probable than the whole. But what did the seasoned professionals say? They estimated the second event, the specific earthquake, causing the flood to be more likely.
How does that happen?
Because the researchers added the because. By adding the specific cause, the earthquake, they painted a highly vivid, cinematic picture in the forecasters' minds. It drastically increased the mental availability of the scenario. Even though adding specific details mathematically narrows the probability of an event happening, psychologically, it makes the event feel vastly more plausible.
A flood is abstract. An earthquake shattering a dam is a movie we can watch in our heads.
Exactly. The text gives another even more visceral example of this. If I pull someone off the street and ask them to guess how many cases of lung cancer will occur in the general population this year, they might give a baseline guess, say 500,000. But if I ask another person how many cases of lung cancer will occur because of smoking, people intuitively guess a much higher number.
Even though cancer from smoking is just a smaller slice of the all-cancer pie, unspecified causes feel abstract, distant, and therefore unlikely. Specified causes feel tangible, real, and therefore imminent.
This completely skews our societal priorities. The author compares two profound tragedies to illustrate this. The Italian toddler versus the Lebanese Civil War. In the late 1970s, a toddler tragically fell into a deep well in Italy. The massive rescue attempts were broadcast live. The child's cries were heard on the radio. His face was plastered on the cover of every magazine. The entire country of Italy and much of the global community was utterly paralyzed with concern and empathy for days.
Meanwhile, as the author points out, just a few miles away from where he was living in Lebanon, a brutal civil war was raging. Car bombs were going off. Mass casualties were a daily occurrence. But the author noticed something chilling. Even the people living in Beirut, surrounded by the constant abstract statistics of war casualties, were glued to their radios, breathlessly following the fate of this one Italian child.
Because the story of one trapped child is a potent, easily digestible, highly emotional narrative. It fits perfectly onto the mental desk. As the old dark saying goes, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic.
Statistics stay completely silent in us. They do not trigger our biological empathy. The text points out that terrorism causes massive global outrage and disproportionate trillion-dollar reactions because it provides a vivid, terrifying narrative of malicious intent.
Meanwhile, environmental degradation quietly kills close to 13 million people a year. But because the environment is a slow, abstract, faceless, statistical killer, it doesn't trigger our narrative alarm bells. We feel the sharp sting of a single man-made villain far more than the slow, grinding math of natural statistics.
We see this in our everyday lives, too. Picture this. You are sitting on an airplane and you happen to be seated next to a very chatty insurance salesman. You strike up a conversation about visiting New York City. You could spend hours beforehand looking up the actual crime statistics for New York, analyzing the data, and realizing that the probability of being victimized is incredibly low. You know the math.
But then, this salesman leans over and tells you a hyper-specific, terrifying story about his cousin's brother-in-law getting mugged in Central Park in 1989. He gives you details. He tells you about the victim's 3 kids, the color of the mugger's jacket, the medical bills.
That single, vivid narrative will absolutely override hours of statistical research. Your brain will latch onto the story, and you will find yourself avoiding Central Park. The image is simply too vivid to ignore. It takes an immense, almost superhuman amount of abstract statistical data to override the biological power of one compelling anecdote.
And what's so refreshing is that the author himself admits he's totally vulnerable to this. He knows the statistics better than anyone. He knows that mathematically, riding a motorcycle is highly dangerous. But he openly confesses that he still rides his bright red Vespa around town.
Why? Because no one in his immediate personal circle has had a severe accident recently. The statistical reality of motorcycle deaths hasn't been attached to a vivid personal narrative in his life, so he finds himself practically incapable of acting on the logic.
This raises an important question. If even an expert who writes books on this topic rides a red Vespa, what are the actual psychological gears turning in our heads that override our logic?
To answer that, we have to look at the literal mechanics of our mistakes. The text introduces us to the dual mode of human thinking, a framework heavily mapped out by the Society of Judgment and Decision-Making, brilliant researchers like Kahneman, Tversky, Paul Slovic, and others. They rough out human cognition into 2 distinct competing operating systems, System 1 and System 2.
Let's define them. System 1 is the experiential system. It is effortless, automatic, incredibly fast, and completely opaque to our conscious mind. Most importantly, it is highly emotional. It is what we commonly refer to as intuition, or what pop culture calls a gut feeling. It operates using heuristics, which are basically fast and frugal mental shortcuts.
And System 1 is not a bug, it's a feature. It is an evolutionary survival mechanism. If you are walking through a dense jungle and you see a flash of orange and black stripes out of the corner of your eye, Mother Nature does not want you to sit down on a log, pull out a notepad, and slowly deduce the probability of it being a tiger versus an optical illusion created by the sunlight.
Because if you do that math, you get eaten. Mother Nature wants your amygdala to fire, your heart rate to spike, and your legs to start sprinting milliseconds before your conscious mind even registers the word tiger. System 1 uses raw, unrefined emotion to force you into immediate action.
Conversely, we have System 2, the cogitative system. This is the slow, effortful, logical, serial processing module. It is self-aware. When you are trying to solve a complex algebra equation or parallel park a car in a tight space while turning the radio down so you can see better, you are using System 2.
Okay, so let me apply this. When I am driving my usual route to work, I am entirely on autopilot. I can arrive at the office and not remember the last 4 traffic lights. That is System 1, handling the driving while I daydream.
But the second a child chases a ball into the street, you slam on the brakes, your heart pounds, and suddenly you are hyper-aware of everything. Wait, no, the brake slamming is still System 1, right? It's the adrenaline.
Spot on. The physical reaction System 1. The deep, logical analysis when you pull over to the side of the road trembling and logically process how close you came to a disaster that is System 2.
So the problem isn't that System 1 is bad, it's that we use it when we think we are using System 2, right?
Yes. Because System 1 is opaque, meaning it runs in the background without a loading screen, we don't realize it has made the decision for us. This leads to what the text calls the round-trip error.
Like confusing no evidence of black swans with evidence of no black swans.
Exactly. In formal logic, there is a massive difference between the statement, there is no evidence of black swans, and there is evidence of no black swans. The first just means we haven't seen one yet. The second means we have proof they cannot exist.
But to System 1, those statements feel identical. System 1 doesn't do nuance, it lumps them together. It takes the active, exhausting intervention of System 2 to pause, evaluate the syntax of the sentence, and realize those are 2 entirely different logical universes.
Much of our trouble in finance and politics and personal relationships comes from our inability to keep System 2 running for prolonged periods. It is just too energetically expensive to constantly monitor our own logic.
But the author, speaking as a deeply skeptical empiricist, gives us a very important warning here. He cautions against trying to map these 2 psychological systems too rigidly onto pure physical brain anatomy.
You will often hear pop science articles claim things like, oh, the emotional primitive System 1 reactions happen entirely in the reptilian limbic brain, but the high-level logical System 2 thinking happens exclusively in the advanced cortical brain.
Right. The author urges extreme caution with those kinds of generalizations. Anatomy has fooled researchers repeatedly over the decades. We naturally assume the cortex is the absolute seat of all high-level intelligence, simply because we humans have a massive cortex, and we like to think of ourselves as the smartest things in the room.
The bird intelligence example in the text completely shatters that assumption. We look at birds, see they have a relatively tiny cortex, and we coined the insult bird-brained. But it turns out certain birds, particularly African gray parrots, possess astonishingly high levels of intelligence.
They can solve complex puzzles, understand concepts of zero, and rival dolphins and chimps in specific cognitive tasks. Yet, when neuroscientists map their brains, that vast intelligence doesn't come from a massive cortex. It correlates with an entirely different complex brain structure called the hyperstriatum.
Which beautifully vindicates the author's empirical approach. Instead of looking at reductive, colorful MRI scans and declaring, look at this glowing fold of tissue, this is exactly where truth and logic live, the author argues we should favor rigorous psychological experiments.
We should observe how humans actually react, how we predictably fail, and how we behave in controlled environments. Focus on the output, the behavior, the predictable biases, rather than obsessing over the precise biological hardware map, because our understanding of the hardware is constantly evolving and often flawed.
Okay, we've diagnosed the disease. We are dopamine-driven story addicts running on System 1 hardware. We aggressively compress complex reality into neat causal fables just to save mental desk space. We let media sensationalism and cheap narratives hijack our risk assessment. So how do we survive this?
The author doesn't leave us hanging. He provides a few stark, highly actionable prescriptions for escaping this cognitive matrix. First and foremost, he demands that we aggressively favor experimentation over storytelling.
When trying to understand a phenomenon, we must favor raw, documented experience over neat, sanitized historical narratives, and clinical empirical knowledge over grand, overarching theories.
And he emphasizes that we must be especially vigilant in environments he calls extremistan. Let's break that term down for the listener because it's vital.
Extremistan is a conceptual domain where a single extreme event can disproportionately impact the total. Think about human height. If you gather 1,000 random people in a room and then the tallest man in the world walks in, the average height of the room barely changes.
Right. Height belongs to mediocristan. No single outlier can ruin the average.
But think about wealth. If you gather 1,000 random people and then a multi-billionaire walks in, the average wealth of the room skyrockets. The billionaire represents 99% of the room's money. Wealth belongs to extremistan.
Book sales, financial markets, social media virality, these all live in extremistan. When you are looking at past events in extremistan, you must remain deeply, constantly suspicious of the easy, obvious narrative. Because in extremistan, the massive, chaotic black swan events dictate everything, and the clean story assigned to them after the fact is almost always a lie.
The second prescription is accountability. Make testable predictions and keep a precise, unforgiving tally of the results. You cannot just float a theory and then backfit explanations after the event happens to prove you were right all along.
You have to put your flag in the ground before the event happens, write down your prediction, and hold your System 1 accountable to the hard math of reality.
And then there's this final, somewhat beautiful tool the text offers. The author uses a great phrase, only a diamond can cut a diamond.
I love this concept. We cannot surgically remove our biological craving for stories. System 1 is always going to be there, humming in the background, hungering for a narrative to compress the world. So instead of fighting a losing battle against our own biology, we can harness it.
We can use our innate love for stories to smuggle in the right empirical messages. Storytelling for a good, empirically sound purpose. We can actively construct narratives that teach us to be wary of narratives.
Which is exactly brilliantly what the author does throughout the entire text. He didn't just give us a dry list of cognitive biases. He gave us the vivid story of the Italian professor sweating by the buffet. He gave us the tragedy of the Italian toddler. He gave us the image of his red Vespa. He is expertly weaponizing vivid stories to teach us profound, abstract, statistical truths.
It is a masterstroke of communication.
So to wrap up this incredible journey today, we started in Rome with a brilliant professor who couldn't stop his brain from inventing a causal heritage. We traveled through the divided minds of split-brain patients, watched dopamine spikes turn Parkinson's patients into casino regulars, and saw how E.M. Forster's Grieving Queen proves that a compelling plot actually reduces our cognitive load.
We watched Bloomberg News invent two entirely contradictory realities out of a single Saddam Hussein headline. And we realize that our brains are constantly actively filtering out the terrifying math of reality in favor of a comforting, sensible fable.
It is a deeply humbling realization. The very mechanism that allows us to function daily in an overwhelmingly complex world is the exact same mechanism that blinds us to its true, wonderfully random nature.
And so I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day, something that builds on everything we've just unpacked.
If our entire conscious human experience is effectively an evolutionary shortcut, a heavily edited, highly compressed narrative that our brain directs in real time just to save storage space and keep us from freezing in panic at the sheer randomness of the universe, are we ever truly experiencing objective reality?
It suggests we live entirely in a simulation of our own making.
Right. And here's where it gets really wild. We are rapidly moving forward into an age where AI algorithms are taking over the heavy lifting of analysis. These algorithms have no biological need to compress information. They have no limited mental desk space. They have no dopamine loops, no emotional system one, and no evolutionary need to save cognitive energy.
As those non-narrative machines start analyzing the world for us, will their raw, uncompressed, high-dimensional view of reality be something our human brains can even comprehend? Or will the pure, unnarratized, statistically accurate truth of the universe just look to us like total, incomprehensible madness?
Now that is the true black swan of our cognition. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and be very, very careful the next time you find yourself using the word because.